Hello, everyone. Hi, welcome to the second breakout room or the breakout session, the afternoon breakout session of the Social Workers Confronting Racial Injustice Conference. We're going to give people a couple minutes to just roll in. We have such a great speaker here today. Very excited. So good afternoon to everyone in the Central and Eastern time zones. Good morning, good continued morning to everybody further west of the Central time zone where I find myself. If you're just joining, we are going to let people trickle in for a couple minutes and then we'll get started. But I will just continue to say good morning or good afternoon wherever you find yourself, whatever time zone you find yourself. Hello, thank you for joining. Also, for those of you who are already here, we want to note that we are waiting for, we are figuring out some captioner stuff. So we will get started. Hold on 1 second. So we'll wait like 2 more minutes while we get this captioning straightened away. Okay, hello everyone. Thank you for joining. We are going to just go ahead and get started while we figure out captioning, but I'll start my my spiel beforehand. And so if you need captioning for right now, you can turn on the auto captions. And okay, we are trying to solve some captioning problems. So we will give us 2 more minutes and then we will get started. Okay, everyone, thank you for joining. I think we are going to go ahead and get started while we sort out the captioning. So apologies to anyone who doesn't have captioning right now. We are in the process of solving this for high quality captions in just a few minutes. But we will just get started right now in the interest of time and solve this as we are able. So hello, everybody. Thank you for dealing with our technical problems. My name is Callie Freitag, and I'm faculty at the Sandra Rosenbaum School of Social Work at UW-Madison. And I'm really happy to be your host for this breakout presentation, What 10 Plus Years of Activism Has Taught Me as a Macro Social Worker with Vilissa Thompson. I have followed Vilissa's work for years, and I'm super excited to have her here with us. So this session comes at a critical time for all of us as social workers. And so thank you for joining in on this important discussion. We have over 3,000 people registered for this year's conference and just about 100 people here in this session, although that will probably grow in the next few minutes. We practice sharing visual descriptions as an accessibility practice. So to share a visual description of me, I am a 30-something white woman with chin-length blonde hair, and my Zoom background is blurred. And next, I'd like to share, again, our university's land acknowledgement. As I said in the morning session, these land acknowledgements can feel symbolic and like not enough, but I personally think that they're important practice to remind ourselves, to root ourselves in our land, in our history, and acknowledge our position in all of it. Here's our land acknowledgement. The University of Wisconsin-Madison and the Sandra Rosenbaum School of Social Work occupy ancestral Ho-Chunk land, a place their nation has called Dajope since time immemorial. In an 1832 treaty, the Ho-Chunk were forced to cede this territory. Decades of ethnic cleansing followed when both the federal and state government repeatedly, but unsuccessfully, sought to forcibly remove the Ho-Chunk from Wisconsin. This history of colonization informs our shared future of collaboration and innovation. Today, UW-Madison respects the inherent sovereignty of the Ho-Chunk Nation, along with the 11 other First Nations of Wisconsin. Okay, so now I'm going to pivot to a few Zoom reminders. This presentation is being recorded and will be available on our conference website at a later date. I think by now we should have active captions, some captions going on. So thank you, Kristen, for dealing with our technical problems going on. Thank you for being here to caption. As audience members, your cameras and microphones will remain muted. And the chat is disabled because we have many people in this presentation. But instead, we'll have a question and answer feature where you can submit questions for our presenters. Any questions generally about the conference or quick questions, I'll answer in the Q&A chat. But we'll also save any substantive questions for Vilissa for the end of her presentation. Also, please note that throughout Vilissa's presentation, she's going to be sharing prompts for you to independently reflect on. And these are not prompts for you to provide your answers in the chat, but instead for you to journal or write to yourself or think to yourself, just so we don't end up clogging the Q&A. Although, you know, we love to hear from you, but there are many people in this, so we want to keep it manageable. Okay, so now it's my pleasure to introduce to you our presenter, Vilissa Thompson. Vilissa, you can hop on your video whenever you're ready. Vilissa Thompson, LMSW, is the founder and CEO of Ramp Your Voice, an organization focused on promoting self-advocacy and strengthening empowerment among disabled people. Being a disability rights consultant, writer, and activist affords Vilissa the opportunity to be a prominent leader and expert in addressing and educating the public and political figures about the plight of disabled people, especially disabled Black women and femmes. In addition to her activism work, she is represented as a speaker by CCMNT Speakers and is represented by Sincerely Nicole for public relations. So Vilissa, like I said, I've been a fan for years. I'm thrilled to have you here, and I can't wait to hear what you have to say. Thank you so much for being here.
No, thank you. I'm so honored to be here. Good afternoon or good morning, wherever you are on today. I'm just really happy to share space. So before I share my screen so we can get started, I want to give a visual description of myself. I am Vilissa Thompson. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a light-skinned Black woman who is sitting in her wheelchair. I have on glasses. My brown hair is tucked behind me, hanging down. I have on a dark charcoal sweatshirt because it's a little chilly here in South Carolina, since we're supposed to get snow tomorrow. I have on like a kind of light pinkish lip gloss, and my background for the Zoom is a sunny yellow. I'm going to give the semantics together when it comes to sharing my screen. Right. And we're going to get started. So as Callie said, today's presentation is about what I have learned as a macro social worker, as a disabled macro social worker. Because I feel that it's very important for us to talk to each other as colleagues, and even as for some of you maybe disabled yourselves, to figure out what are we doing in the profession, how did we get here, and what are some of the lessons learned in navigating this profession and our careers, particularly those of us who are multiply marginalized. Okay. So here's my origin story of sorts. I'm a comic book person, so some of you may be familiar with that lingo. So my journey to advocacy, I'll be honest, it was not on my radar. When I decided to go to grad school for my MSW, I wanted to be a therapist because I wanted to help people. I've always been interested in why people do the things that they do. And I wanted to just really support people in certain ways. But things happen, out of my control. And I really am happy that, oops, hold on, sorry, that my path took this turn. I like to think that in a parallel universe, I have my own private practice and am successful and thriving in that area, and that what gives me solace in the career that I did not take. But a little background about me: I have my bachelor's in psychology, minor in African American studies. I have my MSW that I got in 2012, and I have a state board license still because some people care about credentials, even though I do not. And I aspire to retain an ED in the future. We'll see about that, but for right now, I'm good with my current MSW. I di- discovered macro social work in grad school because, again, like many people that was in my cohort, in my class, I wanted to be a therapist. And most of my friends, half of them are therapists, half of them are in other clinical settings. And in discovering macro social work, I really was struck by the focus on policy, community, advocacy, and activism, and really saw social workers in a very different light than the stereotypical light that we think of social workers, which is doing child protective services work, working in hospitals, working at the VA, and so forth. So, really discovering macro social work got my gears turning and really challenged me to think about my education and my career in a different lens. A year after graduating with my MSW, I created my own blog or organization in 2013 called Ramp Your Voice. That was my way of creating my own space online. And I get into that a little bit later regarding the why. And becoming a macro social worker afforded me the opportunity to combine the subjects that matter to me. I've always been interested in history, learning about why people do the things that they do, what happened, and figuring out the patterns of human behavior is why I major in psychology in undergrad. So combining my own self-interest of the historical, political, the human experience, the human behavior aspect of things, and also bringing my identity into the work, being a Black disabled woman from the South, understanding how my Blackness, womanhood, and disability collide together into an experience that is unique for both me and those that look like me, and want to bring some of those stories into the forefront as well, particularly as I got into the community, the disability community, and realized that diversity was a problem for the community. And I wanted to combine my interests and also who I am as a person in my work. Um, I'll speak a little louder because I see the chat here. Let's see. So, in taking the unconventional route, like I said, wasn't on my radar. But when I realized that macro social work was calling me, I did not hesitate to go forth. But I realized that some of that fear that I had was due to me not seeing macro social workers. Our profession is so focused on the micro, which is great. Micro social work is amazing. But for those of us where that doesn't really fit the macro social work mold, sometimes we're like, how do we ensure that our career has as much meaning as what quote unquote traditional social work looks like? And so once I kind of dealt with the scariness of doing something new, I realized that this route was exactly what I needed to take, given what I was going through at that time in my life, particularly since I was in not just newly graduated, but also a caregiver of my grandmother at that time who had dementia, and she passed within the first couple of years of me doing this work. And I was very grateful that the last few years of her life, I got to be with her and care for her, and knowing that as I was being a caregiver, I was still building something meaningful for me. So doing something meaningful for her and doing something meaningful for me were the two things I was holding. And I'm really grateful now that I'm about 10 years removed from that part of my life. It's something that I'm really grateful for. So sometimes the unconventional route is the best route. So in taking this route, it allowed me to meet other um, macro centered social workers, particularly since when I started my work, and I get to this in the next slide, I started blogging and using social media more, which is a very new frontier for social workers. And it allowed me to build this community that I didn't realize that I needed. I really wanted to be around social workers who had experience like myself. They either had micro social work experience in or after grad school and then transition into macro social work. And so we kind of understood and had the unique perspective of being in both worlds, doing micro social work, seeing what it's like to be a worker, being connected to clients, understanding how these systems impact us, and also on the macro side, talking about these systems and really understanding the dysfunction within those systems and how it trickles down to our clients, to our communities, to ourselves in these roles. So I think that macro social workers with micro social work experience, you know, are invaluable because we are able to see both sides of things and we bring a unique perspective to the conversation. Many of these people that I encountered also understood the importance of utilizing social media as social workers and how it benefited advocacy and activism. Again, this was the 2010s to where most people was coming online. Facebook has really opened up from just college students. We in the transition from MySpace to Twitter and Instagram. So it was really prime time for those of us who are a little bit more tech savvy to really not just find community, but also bring social work, bring our passions to the public. I know at this time the professions like social work, counseling, and others were a little hesitant about the use of social media. And I was there when NSW created the first kind of um, form of the code of ethics about social media use for social workers and some of the pushback against that. There were social workers who I met where their whole specialization was social work and tech. So came up in a very kind of hotbed of time in which we were looking at social media differently as professionals and forcing in some ways the professional look at it differently too and more intentional as to this is the way in which we're going to be able to connect with each other as professionals and also with clients. And now we're going to get into connecting social work and disability, the early years. I kind of went over this a little bit, but we'll kind of do a short summary. Like I said, I began blogging about social work and disability in 2012. And that allowed me to talk about the things that I wasn't really seeing. Some of my first articles that I wrote for a social work platform discussed the school to prison pipeline and how disabled students of color were impacted by that, or some of the political issues that we cared about at that time and how disability was a part of that. I really felt like I was creating this unique path for myself to where I'm able to not just connect my professional life, but also my personal life, my literal existence into the work. And I really didn't see a lot of people doing that quite yet. But then as I started to get acclimated with social media, I did start to connect with other social workers who shared their experiences within this profession, particularly around the lack of diversity of social work opportunities. And I get to that a little later in the presentation. But we were just talking about how hard it is for us to find jobs and community as disabled social workers, and how honestly social media and the internet allowed us to connect with each other and not feel that isolation that I mentioned earlier when you're realizing that your path as a social worker may look different than the rest of your colleagues. And also, this is where, in me blogging about disability and social work, it allowed me the chance to conduct presentations at social work conferences, similar to what I'm doing here, and fill in a profound gap that I saw. Because a lot of our colleagues here talk about disability, but many of them are not disabled, or they may not have come into that identity yet. Whereas myself, I have a twofer of sorts. I'm disabled and I'm a professional in this space, and I can provide two sets of authoritative lenses into what I'm sharing. Both the real life experiences, when I have been a client of services, and also what I want social workers to know when it comes to the diversity and disparities that disabled people endure. So having that dual ability really set out some of my proposals, set them out, differently than other people. And I think that's how I was able to really get more confident in public speaking and being in social work spaces, to where the conversations I was leading were things that people may not have thought about before. So connecting social work and disability became my lane of sorts. And it's something I've continued to do and expand on now 13 years later. So, in thinking about disability and social work, and kind of bringing it to the micro, and the micro in this sense being you, the individual, what is your memory and reaction to encountering a disabled person for the first time? I like to use this prompt because it forces people to think about, when did they see a disabled person for the first time? What was their reaction to that? And also, what was the reaction to those around you? And that last part is something that people really think about, because we have a bad habit in society, particularly when we have kids, because kids are unfiltered in what makes them great. But in that unfiltered ability, sometimes they can say things that we adults, may tend to see as not being appropriate, but it's their truth because they're speaking what they feel. And sometimes that reaction from us as the adults can impact how kids look at people who are different, can look at disability in a negative way. If you have a kid to be like, mom or dad, why is that person in the wheelchair? And they point, and you kind of shushing them up and like, no, no, don't point. You know, think about, particularly if you're like 4 or 5, getting that type of reaction after stating something that you've seen. Think about, you know, the response that you would have internally as a kid. Like, was my reaction bad to that? Is what that person maybe being that cheer is quote unquote bad? Is it bad to notice when somebody's different from me? Think about the covert messaging we may have when we shush children, particularly children, up from being curious, and we do that because we may be uncomfortable, or we may not have the tools to know how to explain things either in that moment or at a later time. So it was always interesting to me when I use this prompt to see people's reactions to the first time they've seen a disabled person, particularly if it's a disabled person that's not in their network, like a family friend, or a neighbor. And in this prompt, I like to use because I see generational differences too. Like for my folks who are maybe older Gen X, boomers, and the silent generation, their first exposure to a disabled person tend to be more within that network, as far as family, friends, family, neighborhoods, so forth. Whereas those of us who are younger, like the younger end of Gen X, so like those born in 74, 75, millennials like myself and Gen Z, sometimes our first exposure to a disabled person may not be within our network, but may be at school. And so when I hear those from the younger folks that I use this prompt with, it really shows me the power of inclusion, because it really does show the generational shifting of disabled people not being in the community, or at least visible in the community socially, and the socialization of disabled people due to our laws and us being more intentional about including everybody, and also the current regression of wanting to hide disabled people, because I just read yesterday that there are 9 states who want to challenge the right of disabled people to live in the community, the integrated settings that we have fought to be able to be in, and also the potential rolling back of the primary education with the potential dismantling of special education or accessible education. So seeing these generational differences matter because we have generations who have always seen disabled people, whether it's in their schools, whether it's not on television, or so forth, versus generation who haven't. So, in thinking about this matters so much in our social understanding and development of disability from the micro and how that can be brought into the macro level in what we do as far as our community work, our social work, and engagement with each other, our activism. That really matters in thinking about the things that we were taught and some of the things we may have to unlearn when it comes to disability and disabled people and our rights and so forth. So we're going to get into these gaps concerning disability and social work that I have seen in the 13 years of doing my activism work. The first set of gaps we're going to talk about is literally within my social work programs. We think about the visibility of disability issues and realities discussed. Now, I started my MSW journey in 2010. And from 2010 to 2012. And when I think about that, there really wasn't much on disability that we covered at that time. Besides, the DSM or maybe a little bit about disparities here and there. But it wasn't until I started doing this started doing my work where I learned about the unique realities of disability and the social issues that we do cover in our program, such as domestic violence or intimate partner violence. I didn't really learn about disabled people having a higher incidences of experiencing violence in that way until I did this work. Or figuring out the need for sexual education for disabled people and the barriers to that. So our programs sometimes have these gaps in really seeing disability as an important, not just an identity, but also a demographic group to really discuss the disparities that are unique to them that at times is even higher than the non-disabled population who also may experience that disparity or that incident. And I think that's something that we need to be mindful of as to what we are teaching in our programs. I will say that I know there have been great movement within social work programs to be more inclusive of disability issues through including disability studies, disability justice, disability rights, disability history in the curriculum. But I know that's not the blanket landscape of our programs. And it's something that we need to think about seriously being more intentional of including. And also, the inclusion is not just in the curriculum, but also our disabled students and disabled faculty and staff. I was the only visibly disabled person in my program. And when I say visibly disabled, meaning that you can, literally see my disability, being a wheelchair user and someone who is a little person. And it was a little isolating, in that way. And I really want our programs to do a better job of supporting disabled students who may desire to be social workers or counselors or whatever, so that they don't feel as excluded in their programs. Even if a program is very welcoming, it can still be isolating or at least feel isolating. And the same could be said for disabled faculty and staff. If you're the only disabled person on your team, that's a hard reality to deal with. Because sometimes, and I know this from having disabled academics as friends, a lot of these programs are not inclusive of their disabled staffs. A lot of people experience a lot of ableism in higher ed, which is something that we don't like to talk about or people don't want to talk about, but need to. And when you think about how our programs, our campuses, our departments, our universities, how inclusive are they of people who teach young minds or the future? And also, are we doing a good job of retaining disabled talent to be in our programs and our campuses? So that's just one gap we need to be aware of. Another gap is amongst each other as colleagues, after graduation. Failure to connect social issues to disability and intersectional disabled viewpoints. A lot of us may not be aware of things, just like as I share the example of me not understanding the disparities and nuances of disability within social and political issues, there's a gap there. I think it's shrinking because of the attention of more the DEI landscape, which I know is under attack at this time. But I know there are people on our campuses in our programs who are, teaching these things on campus and off, and those like myself who are teaching them in settings like this. But we also have to be aware that there is still a big gap in understanding disability outside of the medical model approach that we talk about it in our work. I remember in undergrad we had a class called abnormal psychology. I hope that it's still not labeled that to this day, but I remember the class just being about the DSM. And it's like, why are we naming this class when we talk about um, psychiatric disabilities or mental illnesses abnormal? So we see like some of the language there that we kind of take in as in our trainings and our education. Some of us may not have unlearned those things as our understanding of how people want to be discussed, how things should be how we should approach topics have been updated, have been more progressive. So the onus is on us to really think about how aware is our current landing on understanding disability issues connected to social issues and how can it be improved? And also the lack of employment opportunities. Diversity when it comes to social work jobs. I know that as a wheelchair user, as someone who does not drive due to the cost of modified wheelchair vans, I knew that my job opportunity was limited because of that. Even if I had a car, many homes, most homes, are not wheelchair accessible. So where does that lead me? I know right now we have the greatness of remote jobs. So when I graduated in 2012, remote, people wasn't trying to hear that. When it came to looking for a social work job. And that's why many of us are grateful that we had social media and the internet so we could cobble together some form of a career when social work jobs wasn't really thinking about the diversity of who could be a social worker. And also needing the support for macro and out of the box ways we can use our degrees in education. Not everybody wants to be a therapist. Not everybody wants to work for the VA. And that's great. That's fine. But we also need to create more intentional paths or at least understanding that social workers can do pretty much anything. And I know that I've had to push back against people within my own um, disability space about what a social worker is, like calling me a formal social worker. When I'm like, no, I'm not former. I am a social worker. I'm a macro social worker. There's a lot of education that we, particularly if you're not doing traditional social work, have to do to educate everybody, including fellow colleagues, about what we can do with this education. And I am grateful for my social work education. Honestly, in the slide where I say like I get an ED at some point, ED at some point, and it's because like I don't really need a doctorate. Like the doctorate is for me to get if I get one. But I have done so much with my MSW that has exceeded expectations, and I probably pushed it to limits that it probably would not have thought of when I graduated in 2012. So a social work degree is very diverse, but we have to not only realize that, but also teach each other what unconventional quote unquote social work can look like. And other gaps we need to consider is, utilizing unpaid internships. I know that was a big issue when I was in undergrad. This is when in grad school, and also doing some work in undergrad as well. But we know that particularly for our students who are much marginalized, being disabled, queer, trans, those who come from low income backgrounds, those who may be immigrants or undocumented, asking people to spend 16 to 24 hours of their life each week unpaid to do something to gain a degree is a tall order. It was a tall order for me when I did it in 2010. It is certainly a tall order to ask students to do now. So really think about how can we not exploit our students, particularly those who are multiply marginalized, in trying to retain a degree, particularly with the degree to where the employment income rate is already a little shabby. So we really need to think about the nature in which we are framing the opportunity that students need to have in order to graduate and how that can conflict with their ability to take care of themselves and to be successful outside of the classroom. Also, we can do a better job at showcasing our disabled social work pioneers, our trailblazers, as well as those who are queer and trans trailblazers in the profession. We talk a lot about, Jane Addams, and that's great. But there's other Jane Addams that don't look like her at all, and we and Jim Adams as well. That need to be highlighted. And I think that we all do ourselves a disservice as a profession to have a very whitewashed view of what great social workers look like, both literally and figuratively. And our last thing is understanding our profession's interactions with other social work entities like NABSW, which has always been this kind of gray area with how people looked at the National Association of Black Social Workers, particularly their stance on transracial adoption, which NABSW has been vindicated in their stance on transracial adoption. And what does it mean when, particularly the white space in our profession, isolate um, the more marginalized space because they push back on a narrative that they know through lived experience, through research, is harmful. That's something that we need to think about in the way that we can isolate, each other based on some of our own uncomfortable realities that we're not ready to face. So, how do these gaps impact our work within the disability community? Well, it impacts us in the example that I'm going to give called the right to parent. Because I think it's the kind of the boldest example I can give to really understand why we are perceived as agents of harm and not change, and our failure as a collective to understanding cultural competence, which is a major importance to and with this demographic. So when it comes to the right to parent, I'm going to read my notes here because I got some statistics. About 4.1 million parents in the United States have some type of disability. Many states have policies in place that authorize the removal of children from the home solely based on the fact that one or both parents are disabled. In these cases, there are typically no suspected or proven accounts of abuse or neglect towards a child. The only rationale is a parent's disability. And you may think, Vilissa, that sounds so absurd. It's not. I have written about it. I did an article a couple of years ago focused on Black disabled women in films who are parents and their mistreatment from social workers and related professions during their pregnancies, during their birthing, and also trying to figure out supports, on their parenting journey. In this example, I have read many stories of social workers and related professionals like counselors and so forth coming into a situation. And instead of providing this family with resources so that the parents can be successful in their parenting journey, we take the children away because we look at disabled people as incapable simply because they're disabled. And that's not the case at all. We use our prejudices, our ignorance, our ableism, and weaponize that and not take into account the authoritative stance that we have as social workers to not be agents of harm. Instead of working with doctors and finding community resources to support disabled parents so that they can be the best parent to their child, we take children away from an environment and we don't think of that as traumatizing as it would be in any other circumstance in which a child is removed from the home or from the people that they know. Social workers have a responsibility to be ethical because A, that is in our code of ethics, but also going beyond our code of ethics and really using our heads and being ethical and practical here. If a doctor calls you in or whomever calls you in about a child belonging to a disabled parent or parents, your first thought shouldn't be, let's remove the child from the home. Your first thought should be, how can we ensure that everybody in this situation have the basics and beyond so that everybody thrives? That should be your forethought. And if you don't look at it through that lens, then that's a part of the problem here. And it's why this community have a very big distrust of social workers. It's not unfounded. It is rooted in facts and statistics and stories, heart wrenching stories. And I wanted to bring this up because we have to understand our role in the fracturing of our relationships to this community. And it is our responsibility as social workers, both myself in that as a disabled social worker, and I get into that, the unique position that those like myself are in, but we all have a responsibility to do the healing in those fractured relationship with disabled people and also the accountability that takes place. Accountability amongst ourselves to educate ourselves that this is when we step in and this is when we need to pause and really think critically about what is the best appropriate course of action for everybody involved. And also holding those accountable who may call us into a situation where we are not needed and checking them about their own ableism and their own misunderstanding of who has the right to parent in this example. And I'm using the example because it's a pretty bold one, but we can, of course, take this example into any setting that we're in as social workers. And the main thing is to ensure that we think critically about what we are doing. We think about the moment and beyond. Because these are people. These are not abstract beings here. These are people who look to us as authorities, and other people look to us as authorities too. So that's just an example I want to give about an example of a gap that impacts our ability to build with another group. So, what are things that we should consider? I mentioned before about the delicate dance that disabled social workers like myself have to do because we live in both worlds. We are disabled and we are professionals. We are the bridge that connects the two communities together. And being a bridge is a burden. It's a burden because we know the damage that has been caused by those in our profession against the community. And we fully understand the hesitation and resistance of the community towards social workers. And that's a tall order to hold. But for myself, I see that tall order as being one that I have no problem with answering and engaging with because I know that there are some people who may not listen to no one else, but they will listen to me because I have four letters after my name because of my state board license. And I know that power. I know that understanding. And also, being a disabled person, I know what it's like to be on the other side of my non social work disabled colleagues, what it's like to be a client in certain settings and the mistreatment that you may have endured, or how, on a macro level, the systems fail us and put us in precarious situations in which we're trying to cobble our lives together, and we may have a social worker who may be dedicated to us, but there's only so much they can do because there's funding cuts. I know both sides of the coin, and that's the reality of disabled social workers, and that is the dance that we do that I think goes unappreciated and most likely unacknowledged. So what should social workers like you know? First, we need to interrogate our privileges, prejudices, and biases. Particularly now more than ever, we are living under a regime. We are living in times where even our own educational background as such workers is being dismissed. If there's ever a time to be political as a social worker, it is now. And being political also means interrogating your thought process. Going back to our first prompt, and not just your first exposure of disability, but your understanding of disability. And has that shifted over time? And if it hasn't, why not? Particularly since many of us work in settings where we can encounter disabled people every day, or people who may become disabled because of whatever circumstances that have led them to see us. There's no reason for any social worker to not have a grasp on how they understand disability and understanding the gaps of that, and also the unintentional harm those gaps could do in your interaction with disabled people, whether you work, in child protective services, at the VA, or on campus. And my second question here is, many of us come into this work wanting to help. Why? Why did you become a social worker? I want you to think about that. Have you thought about critically, or have you thought about it in a long while? You know, what motivates you as a social worker, as well as if that motivation is self serving or truly about serving the communities you care about. I'm, the nudge I'm doing here is asking you, is there a savior complex emotion? Or you may have realized you had a savior complex and you've done the work as interrogating, what that looks like and the harm that could be and adjusting that appropriately. We should always come back to the question, why am I a social worker? And if we can't answer that in full, then we got to do some really very important work. And if you can't answer that in this moment, especially that we are all living under, if you reside in the United States, that is deeply troubling, deeply troubling. So, what have I learned in the 10 plus years of doing this work? Make the profession work for you, including who you connect with. Some of my greatest friendships and people I have learned from have been macro social workers, people who do micro social work, people who go back and forth between the two. They have been great in allowing me to be confident about my untraditional path as a social worker and have been brilliant to learn from. And speaking of learning, I always be learning beyond CEU credit. There is not a week that goes by where I don't learn something new in passing. It could be through, we all have these smartphones in our hands. Be something I'm looking at on Instagram or TikTok. Somebody says something, I'm like, I didn't think about it like that. Then I go do my Googles, as the kids say, and look into that a little bit more. Always be learning. You don't know everything. There's always something new to learn. And the moment you stop learning, I feel like that's when your ability to be a good social worker stops too. Community matters as a social worker. Find your people. And I would even urge you in this time to find your place. We all have a responsibility within social work and outside of it to find where we fit in this moment. Who can we learn from? Who can we build with? Who can we be in community with? Who can we fight for? Social work has always been about the broader community, whether you're micro or macro. What's good for society? And this is time that we have to find our people and our place in this moment. And the last thing, particularly those of you who may be like me and take an untraditional path in your social work career or are on one, being unconventional allows for social workers to be viewed differently by our colleagues and in society. We show the ways in which we can stretch this education, our training, our understanding of the world through this lens, and do incredible work that is still social work. And for those of you who may be macro like myself or considering macro, thank you. We challenge the status quo of what social work is. And in these times, challenging the status quo is important. And with our last prompt for today, again, as a self reflection, I want each of you to consider the following. In what ways can we be better? What ways can we better support disabled people and community members as individuals? So that very true micro, the communities we live in, local, state, and regional. And for those of you who are within college campuses or universities, whether you're a student or faculty staff, the roles we have in our respective groups and roles on and off campus. As I said, we each have a part to play here when it comes to social work, particularly now more than ever. And we have to figure out what that is and be steadfast in it. This is the time to where our profession has to really be present, literally for our own stability as a profession, and also for the communities that we serve, whether we're a micro, macro, meso, whatever you are, whether your title is social worker or something completely different. We all have a role to play. And it's very important for us to really understand that in full and then go do it. That's a charge we take when we decide to become social workers. And I really want us to really think about that. So use this time today to really think about what is your place? What can you do to be better? And the very last slide is where you can find me on the internet making good trouble, which is at rampyourvoice.com. You will see on the Ramp Your Voice website that I and my team is hosting the second Ramp Your Voice conference, which is held on the first Friday of June during the even year, because we did an inaugural in 2024, and we'll be doing the second one on June 5th of this year, where we will be showcasing the talents and voices of disabled Black women, films, marginalized gender persons, on that day. So you'll see all the little highlights that we're building up for that event. And also you'll be able to see the archive of the first conference. Just find me at, Facebook. I know, Facebook, I know. But I'm still there posting things, getting better at doing it over there. Twitter, yeah, I know, same thing with Twitter, but still on Twitter. But I'm also Vilissa Thompson on the other platforms like Instagram and TikTok. But that's it from me. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and see what questions you all may have had for me.
Vilissa, thank you so much. I know you've given me a lot to think about, and you've given our audience a lot to think about. So we have some questions in the chat, but before we get to those, because they're a bit more specific, and to the extent that you're able, if you could drop that last prompt, and
Yeah.
Is that possible?
Yes, let me get it.
Okay. And so while Vilissa's dropping the prompt in the Q&A, feel free to take this time to think through questions. We're getting questions about Vilissa's recommendations for people to follow and authors to read. We're getting questions about what's happening in states that are challenging community living. Thank you so much.
Share with everybody?
Yes,
okay.
I think. Oh, no, that went to host and panelists.
Okay,
Could you?
Where do I need to drop it at?
Okay, so where it says host and panelists,
okay,
if you just go to everyone. Yeah.
Okay, perfect.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Do you want me to do that? I think I can be able to do it.
Yeah, because I don't think it allows me on my end.
Okay, gotcha.
Great. And I'm also, I think somebody asked a question about the states thing. And I know there was a link. I just saw it last night, so I'm not very versed, but I would drop the link that I saw in the chat too, so you can share.
Awesome. That'd be very helpful. What Violis is referring to is there's a question in the chat about states that are challenging community living for disabled people. And the question is if states are challenging the Olmstead Act.
Yeah.
Um, what I
And
know has happened. Oh, and so Violis, you're dropping a link for us.
yes, I'm dropping a link because I just saw it last night. So I'm not the most versed on it, so excuse me. But I think this is, I hate to say, hot off the presses of all the things that's happening that
Yeah.
people that we're circulating over the last 24 hours. So I'm still getting caught up myself, but it was on my radar yesterday.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you for sharing.
Hmm.
Um, this is interesting.
Yeah, very.
Um, yeah, now I'm about to go down this rabbit hole. Okay, can't look at that side of my screen. So thank you for sharing. So the other questions we have are who should we follow? Like if we're on Instagram or TikTok or whatever, who are the voices that you're listening to that you recommend that we listen to? If you have any names, I can type them up.
Yes. So the first would be Kia Brown. She has written many books. So it's a variety of folks. She has a children's book, like a picture book that she's written, and that's Kia Keah Brown.
Oh, thank you so much.
And she's a black disabled queer woman. She's a really good friend of mine. She has her own memoir um, that she has written, which was her first book. Then the second book is a children's book, the picture book I mentioned, and then she did a queer young adult book. So a little variety for everybody. Depends on what you like to read. You got some littles that you want to share the picture book with, or you're somebody who loves memoirs or young adult, those are great as well. I really love Kia's diversity in the type of book she has written for that diverse audience. And her specialty is talking about pop culture. Um, she doesn't do a lot of it now, but there's an archive of her writings from like when me and her met around the time, like 2016, of her talking about different pop culture moments and issues, and her sharing her own story as a Black disabled woman that would be worth a read. Um, I would say also there's a disabled writer and poet named Heather Watkins. Um, she has a blog. I'm gonna try to look it up real quick and share it in the chat. Um, I think her blog right now is more of an archive situation, um, but it's um, a great one to get into. Let me see if I can find it. But Heather does some poetry and just a really great voice. Great.
Awesome.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
I'm putting these names in the Q&A under Emery's question.
Yes. Oh, and I found the blog. We'll put that in the chat so you can share.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We're we're doing it live here. Great. Okay.
Yes. I would say
Uh
start with those two. Like I always tell people to read Black disabled women. And I'll leave one who's an academic, Sammy Shock. She has the book Black Disability Politics, and it's open source, so you don't have to buy it. You can read it online. I'll look that up too.
oh yeah. Well, and Sammy is a local celebrity here at
Yes,
UW-Madison.
yes, yes, yes. So
Yeah,
she's hometown for you all.
that's right. That's right.
Um, and so I am dropping that link too, so that you all can read there. Sammy does a lot of work. She's works in the Women and Gender Studies department at um at UL school,
Mm-hmm.
and she does a lot of work on pleasure and disability. She's also a Black queer disabled femme and does incredible work. So that would be my top three. And just kind of getting anyone who's new to this acclimated with a diverse set of voices, mostly queer voices, because that's somebody who is begrudgingly heterosexual. I always try to um, propel the voices of my Black queer women femme marginalized gender folks because their perspectives are ones that I learn from and deeply respect. So that's why two of my three recommendations have been, queer folks because, we're in this together and there's so much we can learn from each other.
That's right. I love that. While we're in recommendation space, do you have any TikTok creators that you particularly like for the TikTokers out there?
I'm not a big TikTok. I'm
Okay,
on
not a big
Instagram.
TikTok person.
I'm on
Instagram.
Instagram. But
Okay.
I will say, and I don't know, let me see. I'm gonna have to look for this later, but there's this Instagram person who I follow who makes disability accessible meals. And that was a very unique perspective that I guess I didn't think about. um, not think about, but seeing someone who may be more able-bodied making disability-friendly meals. Um,
Hmm.
if I can't find it here, I'll email it to you, Callie, to put in whatever resource list you all want to cobble together. But um, they're really great at that, and I love like what she does. She used things to where you don't have to use like knives or anything like that because of some people may have some finer motor skills matters, and I just really like that creativity in a way. So that's been a new follower that I discovered online, and I really like them a lot in showing how we could do what's quote unquote ordinary and still make it disability friendly.
I love that. I know for me, I love anything to do with meal prep because I hate doing it. And so having it be disability friendly, I've seen on TikTok, depression friendly meals or ADHD friendly meals or that or meal prep or that sort of thing, which I find really helpful.
Yes,
Um,
yes,
okay, I think we've answered. Oh, we just got Emery just chimed in with Epicurious
yes,
Expeditions.
yes.
Okay.
Thank you. And I just found the link, so I'll just drop a link of an
All
example
right.
of something that she has made. I think this may be a disability friendly one, or at least you'll see what she's able to do.
Awesome. Okay,
Somebody
I'll
knew what I
post
was
this
picking up.
in.
Somebody picked up what I was putting down. Thank you.
Yeah, that's right. I think we're among friends here.
Yes,
That's great.
yes,
Well, while others think about their questions, so feel free to drop more questions in, everybody. We have
yes.
some time. We have about like 10, 12 more minutes. But Alyssa, I have a question for you. So I, like you, am a lifelong macro social worker or like career long macro social worker.
Right.
But as a professor, I teach a lot of students who are taking macro as a course requirement, right?
Mhm.
And not necessarily, it's not that they're not interested, like they're interested, like my students are awesome, they're really engaged in the world around them, but they have a hard time bridging like their view of their life as like a micro, like a therapist with the macro work. And I was wondering if you could help me, is this me being selfish having you here? So you could help me maybe with your take on how would you advise students who are studying to become therapists about how to advance their macro skills, even though they're doing micro as their job.
I think what started me to be interested in macro was understanding the policy side of things. And the policy, whether you're macro or micro, you cannot escape from as a social worker. Policy will impact how you do your work if you're able to do your work. Just like what I mentioned here, the attack on seeing, BSW, MSW, DSW as professions. Like if the Department of Education decides that our degrees are null and void, what happens to us? That's a policy issue.
Mm-hmm.
That's a policy issue. That impacts how you're able to do your job. It impacts who is defined as a social worker. Because a lot of people, particularly back in the day, called themselves a social worker, but did not have a social work background. And that's how we got licenses and things of that nature. Now, I know there's some issues with the whole licensure thing, accessibility and discrimination and all that jazz, but you can't have necessarily a wild, wild west of a profession when you're dealing with people who are vulnerable, you need some type of training and support to be effective in what you do and not be harmful. And so I think that really bringing those real world understandings of why particular policy matters, if that were what struck me as a student when I took my policy class, and they were those the hardest classes because our teacher was hard, but she was great at what she did. But it made me understand that even if in my life as a social worker, if I'm apolitical, my job as a social worker is not. That's why social work is political. And I think that connecting it to how policy, particular policy, impacts their work. I remember in my first field placement was at an organization that served those living with HIV and AIDS. And at that time, there was a threat to the Ryan White program, at least one of the programs under that. And if you don't know who Ryan White is, he was a young boy in the 90s who had HIV. He was kind of like the face of HIV at that time. And so there's legislation and programs named after him. And I remember Jim Clyburn, because I'm here in South Carolina, came to my campus. And, my field instructor them kind of nudged me to go talk to the congressman about the Ryan White program, which I was happy to do because I'm like, oh, I get to meet another politician because I had just met Obama when he was running for president. So I'm like, yeah, sure. And so I, as a student, went up to uh, the congressman, talked to him about the program. Like, I'm interning at this, organization who serves this population. They're worried about what funding cuts could mean for them to serve the community. And he took my concern seriously, in that moment. So I think we have to think about, how the people who make decisions, not just for our clients, but also for us and how we do our jobs matter. So I think maybe connecting the real world things to them will matter, particularly if you want to be a therapist. Do you want to take Medicaid or not? You know, what is the billing going to look like? Even if you are private pay, thinking about, the kind of super bill that you can give someone, where they're insured, their private insurer, cover the cost. And also, if you are private pay, if people have to choose between going to therapy and buying their medication, that's a dilemma. That's a dilemma there. So even though you're very micro minded, you cannot escape the macro. There is no escaping the macro. When we have people who are in power who do not literally serve the people and remember that the people are their employers. 'Cause I think sometimes politicians forget that, whether it's the federal level or the local level. We are always beholden to the policy decisions that they make that can not only impact our clients and our communities that we serve and may live in, but also our literal jobs. Even with the attack of education right now, you know, like it's pretty, hate to say in these times radical for you all to still have this conference in the attack of DEI in the moment. So and which I think is beautiful, but some schools are not doing DI work. I know a lot of people like myself who do speaking opportunities. Last year was a rough patch for many of us. So you can't escape the macro just because you're micro. And I think that's kind of, I think those of us who are macro, we understand that a little better than our macro folk.
I think that's right. Well, Vilissa, this is great. I actually just got a question in the chat from a former student of mine. So I'm glad that actually my students were here to hear you say this. I'm going to have to remember what you said and maybe just make them watch this video. I'm going to have to
Yeah,
assign
just
it.
clip this part. Just
Yeah,
clip
that's
this
right.
part of it.
And be like, trust Vilissa. Okay, my student Kat says, as an aspiring macro social worker, Kat, you already are a macro social worker. You're not
Yes, you
aspiring,
are
you
one.
are.
No, you are.
Kat says, I do get overwhelmed by all of the policy changes, proposals, and misinformation out there. How do you sort through all of the information to understand what is actually going on in the policy sphere? How do I stay informed without losing hope?
I say for me, it may be easier to pick an issue that you care about. Like for me, I care about racial issues because I am a black woman who lives in the South. Inescapable through the history, through the treatment, through also my family history of what my relatives taught me while with them growing up under Jim Crow. Pick an issue that you care about, and become very versed in that lane. Because when you kind of when for me, I took the time. Cause I'm eclectic in my interests. Whatever it is, I like a lot of things. And so for me, when I started doing macro social work, I'm very politically centered. So I looked at the policies of what mattered to me. And then it trickled down to what's happening here when it comes to education, what's happening here when it comes to healthcare, what's happening here, you know, even on the immigration aspect, or what's happening abroad. One of the things I like to study, for fun, and it's fun for me in a nerdy way, is what is the activism is like and what is taking place when it comes to the continent of Africa. What are my disabled African colleagues doing? You know, there's so much great activism going on in Nigeria and Kenya and so forth. I want to know what's happening over there. It's one of the reasons why I like the conference, we make it international. With the first conference that we had Black disabled women in films from the UK talk about their experience, what it likes to live, in that part of the world. So just really kind of create like a little subject matter or a niche for yourself that you're really interested in. Because once you kind of get a stronghold of that, then it's kind of easy to figure out where to look in other topics or subject matter. But just pick one. Just start with one thing that you're like, if you're really into education, look at what's happening with the Department of Education right now. If you're really into healthcare, look at what is the impact of the rise of healthcare premium and what would that mean for people who may have specialized medication that costs a lot? What could that mean for them? Or being able to access healthcare at all? Like if people are able to successfully dismantle the Affordable Care Act, look into the history of what healthcare was like for people like myself and many others who had pre-existing conditions before the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare. What was that like? Look into that historical aspect. So I would say it's easy to get overwhelmed. Fully understand that, particularly in these times where there's something new happening every day, every day. But pick one thing, one subject to look into, one issue to be passionate about, and dig your heels into that, and then expand if you desire to expand beyond that. But do know that even though this world is exhausting, you gotta take a beat, breathe. You're only one person. You can care a lot, but you also are still one person. You got to take care of home. Home is the ministry. And if you're overwhelmed, then how can you show up for something else?
That's right.
A lot of the work that I do, that I'm kind of known for, that's not in the professional sense, is talking about resting and self preservation and finding joy, which are very radical when you're living in these times. But I urge, particularly our students, particularly since you all have the internet in ways that we did not have when we was in grad school or in college, you know, stop doom scrolling. Stop doom scrolling. The world is horrible, yes, but there's good things happening every day.
Yeah.
Find the good things that's happening. Take a rest. Put the phone down for at least an hour. Just catch your breath a little bit. And I think that's something we have to realize is that the regime wants us to be exhausted. And when we don't rest, we don't find joy, we play into that horrifically to our detriment and also to the movement that we can make if we're rested, if we're clear headed, if we're focused, if we are grounded. They don't want us to have any of those things. So seeking rest, um, unplugging at times is critical for you too. show up for the things that you find out that you're passionate about and the people that you want to protect and support. So I'll kind of leave that little nugget too.
That's perfect. We are at time, but we have one more good
Yeah,
question in the chat. So for those who need to hop off, we hope to see you on YouTube
yeah.
at 2 p.m. Central for Prentice Hemphill's plenary. But if you want to stick around, especially students, you may be interested in this. We have a question from Jess, who also is an aspiring future macro social worker. Jess, just like Kat, you already are a macro social worker. Jess is asking if we have tips on getting into macro social work professionally after graduation. Like Vilissa just says, know that you had an unconventional path, but any ideas about how to get into macro social work would be helpful.
I would say connect with the organizations that do the work that you want to do. Like I say, if I'm politically minded, like when I was in grad school, I got connected to my college's NAACP. And then when I graduated college, I got connected to my um, um, county Democratic Party. So just think about the organizations that you can either work at, volunteer at, where you can meet people who care about the things that you care about. Kind of going back to the last question of similar interests, on different issues and so forth. Make people make connections there because a lot of people that I have met in my career are not social workers, but they understand what I do. And that's what you need, people who understand what you do and what you're passionate about. I met people who are in movement spaces like um, that do movement work, that center racial justice, when it comes to the Black experience. They have brought me into projects that I never would have seen myself in. So be connected with organizations, with entities where people are discussing the things that you care about. You can make those connections, like volunteer. Like I said, like I never saw myself being at my local Democratic Party. I think I got connected with them around the time I created Rapid Voice, and I served like 5 years as secretary for them, going to the state convention here in South Carolina, meeting. I ran into Jim Clyburn again because he has this whole fish fry event that he does, when it's the state convention. Um, yeah, get connected in that way. I also, when I was getting into my activism work, served as a member at large and also vice chair for the South Carolina, what, ARCA South Carolina, which is an organization that centers on the experiences of disabled people who have intellectual developmental disabilities. That really got me into knowing, you know, on the policy level, what's happening, in the state. I think at that time when I got on, I think we had finally got the R word removed from the state um, legislations and things of that nature some
That
years
took a
ago.
while.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
so you kind of learn. So I learned on what's happening on the state level. I know there's the art. They continue to do um, like a day at the Capitol. That way to where they bring disabled activists, advocates in the state, bring them to the Capitol, talk about the issues, the whole day. Like many groups have their day at the state house or whatever like that. Um, and so just find groups who are doing the things that you care about, and tell them that you're a social worker, that you're a macro social worker. You may have to explain what that is so they can get, the stereotypes about social workers out their head. But I think once people get it, they get it. And and then be open to getting out of social work. Like getting out of it meaning like your title may not be social worker. That's what I mean by that. But be comfortable with that too. But know that regardless of what your title is, like I may have said in the presentation, you're always a social worker. You are bringing those values, that code of ethics into every role that you have, regardless of what the title of it actually is. So, don't be afraid of being unconventional, as a macro social worker. Like tap into those interests. Reach out to organizations, follow them online. You see a group that's doing great work that you can participate in, whether it's in person or virtually or hybrid, go for it.
That's wonderful. And I couldn't have said it better myself if I tried. So, Vilissa, I think we will end here. Thank you all who stuck around for this end, and for this lovely conversation. And big thank you to Vilissa Thompson. You can find her at Vilissa Thompson on Instagram, Ramp Your Voice online. And just thank you for being here. And we hope to see you at 2 p.m. on YouTube for the plenary session with Prentice Hemphill. The link is on our conference website.
Thank you all so much for having me here. I love talking to social workers. Very glad to know about this conference because I didn't know about it. So just happy to be here and share space. Always good to come home, so to speak.
Love that. Well, thank you and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.